Hello, hello. Welcome to Music as a Metaphor. This is Lyndall Duskant. I'm a singing pianist, educator, student of jazz, student of metaphysics, and a very long and slow but becoming truer and truer by the day born again convert to Christ. So I'm happy today to talk all things music. In particular, I want to talk about a subject that we've been talking the last few weeks, at least a month about, is the idea of adults getting out, playing music in certain settings. And as I was just out at a jazz jam, I thought it'd be a great time to talk about the jazz jam experience. A lot of people find it really very intimidating and think they would never be a part of it. And I think in many ways, too, it might be a diminishing scene. So I want to talk about my experiences in the past with it, talk about my recent experiences, talk about why I enjoy jazz jams, and some strategies on dealing with how to get up there yourself if you're even remotely interested. And if you're not ready to get up there, why it'd be great to go and listen in for yourself. I also want to talk a little bit about some microphone technique, too. But before we get there, there's a couple of other short topics that I'd like to sort of hit, and that is the idea of jamming up the frequency and also the idea of dimensions. So this is Lyndall Duskant. You're listening to Music as a Metaphor. We're in mid-July 2024, and this is a pre-recorded show as I'm traveling these days and not able to get a live episode up. But thanks so much for joining us today. Actually, just joining me. So, okay. Yes, it has been La Vida Loca around here for me. Things, I'm still could track it back to that darn eclipse. I feel like energetically speaking and from a sort of spiritual warfare standpoint, things have been off the hook. Things have been very, very different, very, very intense. And I've been having just my own issues with staying focused and having little blips here and there. I don't know if you guys are experiencing that as well, where you're having, just little tiny, forgetting things, feeling more forgetful, that typical situation where you walk into a room, you forget why you were there. I've also been pretty tired, just having a lot of a need to rest a lot these days and trying to honor that, but also trying to stay busy because I don't want to go the other way and sort of get a bit depressed, which I think is also possible if you're following too closely any level of the news from mainstream, which seems to be imploding with the recent Biden debates, all the way into the alternative media, all the way into some of the far corners I've been going lately. Where people are talking about the spiritual warfare and the shifts that have been happening. So the first thing I want to bring up today is an idea that came to me just today when I was on a walk, and it's the idea of jamming up the frequency. Because in this spiritual warfare battle, I've talked a lot about the idea of being cognizant, bringing your music to the table, bringing your prayers to the table. And I was reminded today about how important our prayers are, because lately, because of some of the struggles I've been facing, it's felt like I'm falling very short, and it feels like I'm getting caught up in, what somebody, I think it's Celestial, a prophetess Celestial talks about. Once again, I'm not promoting, nor am I dogging anybody when I bring them up here. It's just when I listen to things and something catches my ear, I like to share them because I feel like that's from the Holy Spirit. But that doesn't mean I condone or back somebody in their entirety, especially these days on YouTube. Like, you can watch one video from somebody and be like, yeah, and then the whole back catalog, if you spent time, it's like a no. So anyway, but Celeste is a prophetess, Celestial, I think her name is, and she's talked about this idea that I really resonated, and that's pressure points, and that's just the idea of people like exploding, like just losing their temper, and I not having the discipline to hold your tongue. This is something I've talked a lot as well on this the show about the last couple of months, is this idea of just being discerning about what you say and you don't say. But what I didn't speak about as much is the idea of the discipline it takes when you're triggered to hold your tongue. right? And to not fight back. And this is especially tricky because many of us have felt like in our lives we didn't speak up enough for ourselves. And so sometimes there's that over tendency, the legalism of like all good, all bad. So now I have to speak up for myself all the time. And if I don't, then I'm not honoring myself. But I think in reality, in the world we live in, the warning that came from my soul, and then I heard it echoed on this channel, is the idea that no, we're living in a different world and people are losing their temper and people are literally losing their minds. And so you need to be very, very careful about your own tongue. And even if somebody is doing something that's very disrespectful, coming at you with something that's horrific, in reality, you have to be very discerning about returning that, right? To getting engaged on that level, being part of the division, being part of the hate. And I've been having to really work on this. And as I was walking today, really praying about it, it came to me this idea of jamming up the frequency, because lately, because I can be engaged in these internal battles myself, like it's something might have really made me angry, or in reality, I'm noticing I'm walking around with an injustice, like an anger at the injustice. And I'm doing a fast right now, so I think it's coming to the surface even harder. And where do you aim that? Because it can be very wrong to misaim that. For example, if you're frustrated with the way a corporation is working, the service they've been giving you, they're asking you to pay more money, and the service is getting worse and worse, and you're basically powerless to do anything about it. So you call up the guys on the phone. Those guys really can't do anything. And so venting on them is really not the wisest use. And so you have to, be sort of discerning about these things and learn how to hold your tongue, even when you feel this anger and this rage, or even when somebody is, indifferent to something that you're dealing with. All of this takes a lot of discipline, but what I'm recognizing is that as somebody who goes to that place and prays, or let's say that you're in an environment where there's suffering and you don't speak up about it, there isn't really anything you can say about it. You have to just sort of silently pray for a scenario. That is jamming up the frequency. I thought of this in particular because I was staring at the One World Tower, whatever it's called. It's a building I really hate. I always feel like it's giving like a big middle finger to everybody. If you can see the skyline from New York far away, it towers above all of the other buildings, and it just feels like a middle finger to me. And it feels like when you're in New York, there's nowhere you can go that you don't see this darn thing. And on top of it is this huge antenna, and it always just makes me wonder, like, what the heck is going on with that building. And so today I was just staring at it, and I didn't, I wasn't really in the mood to sing a song. I was just barely able to be there, doing a little bit of exercise, just kind of keeping my KIT, keeping it together. That's a Bowfinger quote. Just KIT, keeping it together. But just being there, you can jam up frequency. Even if you feel like you don't know what else to do, holding the presence, holding the space can be doing a lot for this crazy world we're living in right now. You just don't know, because we are dealing with things on a energetic and spiritual level. So jamming up the frequency can come from as simple a thing as going somewhere and being present and being witness. Prayers on top of it, even more powerful, right? And you don't have to necessarily, get it engaged in full on spiritual warfare if you don't know how to do that, or if you're not able to stand in your authority enough to do that, which, can be difficult. And this kind of goes to the idea of playing your music too, right? Sometimes it's very, very difficult to get into a place where you own your authority, that you feel strong enough, confident enough to get up in front of, let's say, a jazz jam and sing. Sometimes you can feel such backlash on the inside from that, such a desire to stay hidden, stay quiet, run away, whatever that is, right? So sometimes just standing there, showing up is enough. And that's the idea of jamming the frequency. Now, if you can sing on top of it, if you can get into a place of praising and worshiping and really feeling the blessings of the Holy Spirit, now you really know that you're doing that, right? But the message that came to me is that sometimes it's just enough to go and be, and to be, you might not feel like an empowered person at the moment, but that's where sometimes we just have to walk in faith. And we won't always feel on the inside like this amazing, body of Christ. But in reality, if we'll just show up, if we'll just keep continuing to have our faith, even if we feel very weak, we're still participating. We're still part because we are intending to do so, right? And through our faith, Christ can use us in ways that we have no idea about. No idea. You can be a body of Christ just through your faith. That's one of the biggest things that people emphasize, is believing in Jesus makes a huge difference. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus at this point, then I don't want to turn you off and say, oh, heck, I'm not speaking to you, because that's not the case. This is not a black and white issue. And I'm somebody who has taken such a long time coming to this that I don't want to scare anybody off with that discussion. But I hope that if it is something that you're even the most remotely interested in, that it's something that you will take on for yourself to pray to Jesus and ask about, to find out more about. So I want to change topics a little bit and talk about dimensions, because on that route I've been listening to a very interesting woman who talks a lot about hang on a second, something is flashing in my apartment. Something possibly supernatural is going on here. Hang on one second. Okay, so not really sure what happened there. Don't have an explanation, don't have a logical explanation, but I was seeing almost like as if somebody had a mirror and the reflection was on the wall. And it was like coming from behind me, and I don't see anything. I'm actually going to look one more time. And it stopped. So this is interesting, because this is my opinion, that the veil really was thinned, that it's been being thinned for a long time, but perhaps something really did take another level during the eclipse or something, because there's been so much more supernatural activity, just strange, unexplained things going on. And so that gets me into the idea of dimensions and the idea that they're very real. Now, I have a whole episode where I've talked about this, but I heard something interesting from a woman. Her name is Amanda Byes, and she's from South Africa. And I find that I'm very attracted to Christians from South Africa because, and I use the word Christian loosely because I recognize that there's a lot of people who claim to be Christian that would never even, they're secularists. They don't even believe in the idea of the spirit world, right? They're very much materialist, and they're not really true followers of Christ, I would say. So I understand when I say Christian that actually scoops a lot of people in there. But in Africa, there's a lot of people who have converted to Christianity, and their Christianity is one that absolutely embraces the biblical teachings, but also their own consciousness understanding of there being more than just this material world, and things being about more than just having a job and getting a family and the prosperity gospel type of mentality, which is so rampant here in the United States. But in Africa, their mentality has always been much more closely related to supernatural aspects. And this woman has done a lot of research with people who have come out of SRA, satanic ritual abuse. And I've just been on a rabbit hole listening to her because I think that she has some interesting knowledge, and in particular brings in the Nephilim, which I think is a very pertinent subject. Not the subject of this particular episode, but something I think is very pertinent. So in this, she was talking about the dimensions, but she was relating it in a biblical sense that I never made this connection before because, I'm newer to the Bible. I've only really been reading the Bible the last, 4 years. Absolutely have fallen in love with it. And before that, I came from a lot of different spiritual texts, and I definitely am absolutely in love with the Bible, and so thankful that I am here with it. But there's many things I don't understand, and I've heard my whole life, like the Christianese, but I don't know what people are talking about. I more have come from New Age, where we talked about dimensions, as I mentioned, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. No, actually the third, the fourth, the fifth. And then I also came from, quantum physics, which is where the whole idea of dimensions comes from. And it's an idea I've on this episode that I talk about dimensions, I talk about why dimensions has always been on my radar as something very real, just vibrating at a different frequency. And that many of us, just the way that we're talked out of our imagination and our creativity through the education system and through the indoctrination of culture, we are talked out of our ability to recognize these subtle energies. But of course, there's psychics and there's people who have never lost it. And David Icke, is great at talking about the spectrum, right? The electromagnetic spectrum, and how we see such a small portion of it. So when you get into the physics of it, there really is no disputing the idea of there being other dimensions. And New Age was one of the only places I saw people addressing this, other than actually Picasso and the Cubism movement and sort of the turn of the century, when there was some philosophers and artists that were really trying to conceptualize what these things would look like. And so I've always been very interested in this topic, and now relating it to the idea of second heaven and third heaven is what Amandra Byes has brought to the table. And to me, truth should be explained a million different ways. If it's truth, then it should be reachable from every direction, right? So it would make sense that we have different languages and different cultures to describe a phenomenon that is the truth for the human experience. So in the religious circles, they've been saying this for some time, I guess, that we have Earth. And the way she would explain it is that it's like the one, two, three dimensions are Earth, and that's where humans are. Then there's the second heaven, which is where I've heard that like Satan is. Like there's sort of the king of this world, or not the king, the prince of this world, the way he's described, or like our enemy, or like the ruler of this world, or like the Gnostic God, whoever you want to see it. There's a ruler of this world that is not the ultimate God, and him and all kinds of his creatures are reigning in that dimension. Like, for example, if you've heard of the reptilians, they would be in that area. And I had heard it described more as the fourth dimension. And I had heard that we are living in a time where we are starting to, the veil was thinning between us and that dimension. And the crazy thing is that this is a whole topic that I won't get into, but just that for many of us who were in the New Age, or that we were, knew there was these dimensions, but we didn't have the spiritual discernment to really understand that not all things that are spiritual are of God, that we played around with the fourth dimension through astral voyaging, or like, is this where we go and we dream at night? We were very interested in that area, but we didn't understand that there needed to be spiritual discernment in that area as well, because that area is actually ruled by beings that we can't see in the three dimensions, but they can see us, right? So they have an advantage over us. And then when we go start dipping in that world, without really knowing what we're doing, without, having our traumas healed and all these things, then it can really cause trouble in your 3D life, but you don't even have the words, you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the understanding. So many people suffer from this. A lot of people feel like this is also where the UFO stuff is coming from. This is why, certain craft can kind of come in and out of reality. We're dealing with that particular dimension, which she described it as the fourth, fifth, sixth. I've always described it as the fourth. Whatever it is, we're talking about the same thing, right? Because then by the time you get to the next one, I believe she called it the third heaven. And I hope I'm not wrong about that. I will correct myself the way I need to, if that's the case. That is where you have more of the idea of like heaven, right? Like if you make it there, you've been purified enough. Your consciousness is purified enough that the suffering is ended. These beings cannot cross into it, because just from a frequency standpoint, they are service to others. So there's a barrier that happens because they are not connected with God. They have not done the work to reconnect with God or to stay connected with God. They cannot enter into that. So that's the space where you would go, where I think a lot of us thought anything besides this world is heaven. But in reality, the third heaven is where Jesus is and where God is and where most of us want to get to. Although not all of us, because I think there's a large portion of people that have made deals with those beings in the fourth, and they're perfectly happy staying right here, ruling this world. But that was just an interesting concept that I had heard that I wanted to expound on the dimensions, and it also led me into a topic that I wasn't going to talk about, but I think is a good idea to talk about now, and this is the idea of fractalization. I was fortunate enough to compose for a movie called Fractals by the avant-garde and brilliant director Eric Norcross. And this was like maybe in the first couple of years of the COVID experience. He was able to produce his movie regardless, and I worked on the full-length feature soundtrack. And what was interesting was it was a lot more music than I thought. I mean, it was almost solid music, a lot of music, and it was a really great project to do. It was really challenging and really wonderful, and Eric is wonderful to work with. And one of the reasons I love working with him is he has such a brilliant mind, even though we come from very different directions on things. And so I've always been interested in fractals, because a long time ago I read about holographic universe, and the idea of fractals is that, you zoom all the way in and it looks exactly the same as if you zoom all the way out. It's an incredible, fractals are absolutely miraculous thing in nature, and that you actually find them a lot. Fractals are actually happening a lot in nature themselves, and it's just an amazing concept. And that to me could relate to the concept of God, because it's very difficult, I think, for us to understand who and what God really is. But fractalization might be that he can go all the way down into the details, and then he can zoom all the way out, and he's sort of present in all of it. Right. And that's that feeling of him being so personally there for us when we pray to him, but also, us being part of a much bigger picture and being able to get past our own selves to recognize that God is, can love everybody with that personal level. He doesn't have to play favorites. It doesn't work that way for him. And fractalization, I think, is an interesting concept, because the idea would be that God really would be everywhere here. Okay, and that I'm going to leave the whole idea of like, well, then why would there be evil? And why would there be these things, right? I'm going to leave that question aside, because it's a good question, but honestly, it has been answered in some pretty great ways by greater theologians than I, that you can look into for yourself. So what I'm really trying to point to here is, let's take the concept that there really is only God, that there really is only his sovereignty, and that this evil has been allowed from a certain standpoint because he gave us free will. But ultimately, God is sovereign. Even the things that are playing out in our day have been prophesied for a reason, to prepare his people, and that Jesus coming was the defeat of all of it. It's just still playing out in time, which to God there really isn't such a thing as time, because God would be everywhere all at once, all things. And so fractalization would mean that you can zoom in on his creation here and find the whole of him in anything that you want to truly focus in on. This is the concept I want to bring. This is, as far as I know, I haven't heard anybody else talk about this, but that doesn't mean they haven't. It's something that intuitively I've felt and been conceptualizing for a long time. And this is why I feel like studying a craft, or really listening to your own calling and following those passions in your life, can always lead you back to God. Now, some people would argue that a lot of it's been corrupted and it can lead you astray, and that's true. But I believe that if your heart is pure and your intention is pure to know truth, that God is truth, and that you will be led there. You just have to be walking in a certain level of sincerity and have the strength and the courage to truly face the truth, because it might be that you've been opposed to it. You've been doing a lot of things against it that are hard to see. And so having something like a musical practice can be a fractalization of God. You can use music to go so deeply into the details that suddenly you understand the whole. That's my idea that I'm trying to present. So I'm calling it like fractal voice lessons, or I don't know. It's still a concept that I'm trying to come up. Fractalization of voice lessons, or the fractal approach to voice lessons. But in reality, what I love about it is that if I even talk to you about voice lessons, using them in a way to get closer to God, using your voice, because your voice would be a microcosm, it would be a reflection of everything you need to see on your journey to get closer to God. He would bring all of it up through whatever it is you need. He personalizes our journey on that level. He fractalizes it. And so you would, through your voice, if you face whatever, let me back up. With this concept, if you truly face whatever is right in front of you, it's the perfect thing for you in order to get closer to God. Like, He is always calling us home. He is always pulling us home. And so the voice is the same way. The voice, every single day, if you have a journey with your voice and you're working on your voice, it's never static, right? It's always changing. You know, I had a concept of like, oh, I'm just going to learn voice. And then one day I think I had this concept about life too. Like, you work hard for like 10 years, 20 years, and then all of a sudden life becomes easy and you're on easy street and you're just enjoying your life. I think that's an illusion, especially in the time period we live in. And especially because life is we are unfortunately engaged in a spiritual battle. So it's never going to be that unless you're sort of deciding to cipher off into an illusion. But if you want truth and you want to face it, then it's an everyday journey, right? Getting closer and closer and closer to God until one day you return to Him. Now, what that looks like, I can't tell you because I'm not there. But I can tell you that, you know, as I mentioned, that there's these amazing full circle moments that you can have where you know you're on the right path and you know that you're getting closer to Him, that you can hear Him more, you can feel His love more, you can feel the fruits of the relationship with Him more, and that the voice can be such a beautiful tool, such a fractal where you're zooming in and you're just getting to know your voice more and more and more. But in the process, everything that's blocking you from knowing Him is being brought up and worked through and sung through and expanded on. And as you do that, you're connecting with Him and the whole. And as you do that, that's much harder to discuss, right? Here in this plane of existence, it's very difficult to talk about the great mystery of God, but it doesn't mean that you can't start to begin to understand Him more, or at least to have these moments of revelation with Him, this connection. And I'm using him, yes, and I'm a woman because I'm not going to play all those games of the pronouns and this and that. When I want to speak of a God that has been so kind and caring to me, and that I truly believe will help anybody who goes to Him. But there's these blocks we have to face. He can't just snap His fingers and make it like we're back with Him. So we have to pick something. We have to pick a way to daily walk with Him in this life. And whatever that is for you, you'll know, because it's what's right in front of you. That's the fractalization. What's right in front of you is the perfect thing because it is God, right? I don't know if I've explained that well. I won't go on and on about that, but this is a concept I'm sort of working through, and felt like since I sort of was kind of riffing a little bit today, maybe it was a good time to bring it up and something I'll talk more about. So that being said, let's step into the idea of jazz jams, because speaking of vocalists, though I am a pianist as well and I love piano, when I'm at jazz jams, I'm really just singing. Why is that? Well, the truth is, as a pianist, there is a dexterity level that many, many, many jazz artists have. Let's say jazz pianists. I'm just going to talk about jazz pianists that I have not reached in my hands. Now, is that in part because I quit piano lessons when I was 13 and picked them up as an adult? Probably. That's part of it. I would also say that after I got out of jazz school, I spent most of my, professional career playing some jazz, but not being as focused as you really need to be. I mean, most of the jazzers that get to that uber level with jazz, they only play jazz, at least for a certain portion. And I never did that. And in part, it was because I came to jazz because I loved improvisation. The real music that made me want to, learn music and pick it up again as an adult was jam bands, which has tons of improvisation but doesn't have the same chord structures. Not to say that those guys don't have the dexterity of the jazz guys, but in many ways, the chord structures that you're dealing with are easier than in jazz. And if you're dealing with, like, let's say bebop, dang. I mean, you're talking about uber speeds, you're talking about being uber fast. And then on top of that, there's many, many jazz musicians these days that actually studied classical up through a certain point and then turned to jazz. And when you do that, there is a certain level of dexterity in your fingers that I've never focused on. When I was young, I played classical music, but never seriously. And like I said, I quit when I was 13. And then since I've picked up music, I do things to practice my dexterity, but I'll be the first to admit that it's not on the level of a professional jazz musician. But when it comes to singing, I can hang with these cats. And that's because I've been always singing. I never quit singing. I've been singing my whole life. And so it's fun for me at jazz jams to focus only on my voice. And I will also mention that part of this, part of my issue with not playing jazz piano is something that I may or may not tackle as I go forward, because part of it is just having the kahunas to just get up there and sound terrible and to spend a certain amount of time, and then you can get there, right? And then once you can start hanging with the guys and getting up there and playing, well, that's all you need to really get better. But this is one of the things that has stopped me and stops many people. And it was happening at this jazz jam the other night too. People talking about most of those musicians actually do have it memorized. So they already have a certain level of memorization with the standards. And on top of that, it depends on what jazz jam you're going to, because there's some serious, serious jazz jams, okay? In New York City, like one example would be Fat Cat, Meserole. Oh gosh. I'm a little bit out of touch with some of them. I haven't been to them in a long time, but those are, to name a few. Those guys are world class. Okay. Like, for example, if you travel to another city and you're there on a professional jazz gig, you might go late night and sit in. I mean, one time I was at Fat Cat and Robbie Coltrane came in. So these places are not to be trifled with. You really don't, it's uncouth to show up and not be ready and try to sit in with these guys. It's really uncool. Because these guys, the jazz jam at that level is functioning as a networking event. It's functioning as them honing their chops. It's functioning at a lot of levels, and you can learn a lot from going there. And maybe you do get to sit in. I mean, it depends on what your level is, right? But you really need to be respectful of that. Not all jazz jams are for beginners, whereas some are. And even better than that are situations where, and I was in quite a few of these, where you get people coming together weekly and you get to, sit there for 2 hours and play through standards with them. That's one of the best ways, because now you're not just like spending 2-3 hours at a jazz jam and getting to play one song. If you're really just needing to form your chops, if you're really just early on. As far as the memorization thing, I will say too, some jazz jams, a lot of them really, you're expected to have everything memorized. And when these guys come out of jazz school, they do, right? A lot of them have everything memorized by the time they get out of jazz school. A lot of them playing, as I've mentioned before, 20, 30 years of the same song. So having it memorized, no problem. Now, whether then they go to the next level of being able to transpose it to any key. I was talking to a friend about this recently, because when I was in jazz school, the thing that they taught us was, if you really want to know and be like a legit jazz musician, you don't just learn a song in one key. You do know what the original key is, because that's what people default to, but you learn it in every key. And you use that level of Roman numeral type of scaffolding in your brain, where you know the changes of a song in such a way where you could put it in any key, no problem. And truly, there are jazz musicians that are that way. But I will say that it has been more varied than people want to admit, because sometimes these guys will have it memorized, but when you ask them as a singer to put it in a different key, they don't play it very well, but they don't tell you they don't know it. And so I will say my own personal experience with that is that Not everybody, that it's some of these. Now, if you're at Fat Cat in those places, yeah, those guys most likely, but I don't know. I'm not testing them. And also, to be honest with you, they're really only putting it in other keys for vocalists for the most part. Otherwise, those guys really are, for the most part, playing it in the original key. And sometimes there's a tune that's in a few different keys, but I don't really, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't really see why like a saxophonist would get up and call it in a different key. I mean, so these guys are really good at these songs in their key. And as a vocalist, that's kind of what you want to go. I mean, one of the first things you do when you're trying to pick out songs to go to jazz jams is do the songs that or this is at least my strategy, do the songs that you can sing in the original key and they're pretty good, but not all of them are going to work that well. And that was partially my experience with this last jazz jam I'll speak about. But I want to mention also and say that there is still a huge level of musicians in the jazz world that don't like jazz vocalists. I feel like it's changed a lot. I do feel like there's a lot more of an acceptance of that. And in part, it's because the vocalists show up. And so if jazz jams are struggling, then they really appreciate having vocalists because the vocalists show up week after week. And that's some of the jazz jams that I'm involved. They appreciate the vocalist if for no other reason than they show up and week after week really support. Whereas there seems to be, in certain areas, less of the actual, jazz cat musicians that can show up and play. And so, but the idea behind why certain jazz musicians don't like singers, I heard one time from a very, very good friend who's a old school. I'll say he's old school because he's older than me, and I'm old school at this point. And so it might be more the old school guys. And I ran into this when I was young, that, the voice isn't an instrument. And I think in a way it goes back a little bit to the boys club. I will be honest with you, because there are some old schoolers that really feel like jazz is really a guy's thing. And it's not their fault. I'm not bringing this up from a feminist issue to be like, you should let us in, but the thing is that in my opinion, women have superior voices. I'm going to say that. I think women have a handle on singing voices at this point. And maybe that's, and that's merely in the jazz world. You've got crooners, you've got those guys that sing Sinatra. But as far as the up and coming jazz musicians, a lot of times it is women. And in many ways, I think people prefer the female voice to male voices. So I think it can be a little bit unfair that that the old school cats, I can't remember what my friend, he basically was saying the singers hold them back, kind of. They can't really go to those places they want to go when they've got a singer. And in some ways that's fair, because I'll be honest with you, when singers show up, we want to put it in our key. The singers are the exception to the rule, which is another reason why I only sing at jazz jams. Because we get to pick our songs. Okay, you can show up and say, I want to sing this song and I want to sing it in this key. And they do it for the most part. Now, some of the guys, they don't want to do it, right? And they don't want to have to transpose it. And it's not fun for them. And they don't get to go as out as they would want to go, right? And get as funky. But that's also why they need us, because we reconnect them with the audience, right? Because these jazz cats sometimes can just go off on their own tangents. And one of the problems with jazz music today, in my opinion, is that it's the same thing that happened with modern art. If you know the history of it, then you appreciate what they're doing. But if you don't know the history, it got so intellectual and so far removed from what people's tastes are that they don't connect with the audience. It really becomes only for the musicians themselves and for the musicians in the audience that can get it. And the rest of the people get bored with it. They don't like it. It's over their head. It's not the vibe they want. And that honestly just happened to me when I walked into this jazz jam the other night. The set that began the night, I know how hard it is to do what those guys are doing. It's just not the vibe I wanted to listen to. It just wasn't. And so in that way, when jazz musicians invite singers up, even for one song, even for two songs, we can bring the audience back in, because singers, guy or girl, we connect with the audience in a way that instrumental only jazz has a hard time these days. And it's not all their fault. Part of it is the lack of music education that's happened, the lack of exposure to jazz music in general. But I would also say part of it is the sterilization and the fact that jazz has become very academic, and it's almost become classical. It's so many of these musicians are classically trained, and then they go to jazz, but they always in some ways keep more of a classical formal approach to it. And so they do well in these audiences where everybody is, paying like $50 for a ticket, and they're sitting there and, just listening to every word, and they themselves are learning an instrument, and they know how difficult it is, and they listen to a lot of jazz. Maybe they were raised on jazz. I will say this is only in America, because in Europe, at least when I was there, I found that a lot of people, young, old, a lot more people listen to jazz than they do in the United States. So that goes against these jazz musicians. But that's part of their issue, is that they lose the audience. It's not popular anymore, whereas jazz used to actually be popular and the people actually liked it. And it wasn't just for them and the other jazz musicians in the audience. And that happens big time at jazz jams, right? Because it's almost all jazz musicians there. Not at this one that I've actually been going to. It's pretty great how there's just people there to listen, which is wonderful. But it's also a lot of vocalists. And the vocalists tend to be a bit more popular than the straight up jazz instrumental for the modern world. So that's my advice to any jazz musician who's listening. I think you really should consider at least inviting a singer up for one or two songs in your set. It can make a big difference. But keep that in mind when you're going to picking out a jazz jam or going to certain jazz jams, that some are very vocalist friendly, some are kind of vocalist friendly, and some are not at all. And in any of these scenarios, you want to kind of know what you're doing. Okay. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a perfect singer. What it does mean is you have to kind of understand the protocols. So I learned a lot from my teacher, Carrie Christ, in Paris about proper etiquette for these type of things. And sometimes you need to be walked through it. So proper etiquette would mean that if, number one, in my opinion, I don't think Carrie told us this, but I can't remember everything. I'm just going to say I'm massively influenced by Carrie, but I don't remember exactly everything that she taught me because it's been a long time. But one of the things is that if you can just do a jazz standard in the original key, it's naturally in your key, great, do it. Okay. The second thing would be that if you know you want it in a different key, that you actually bring a copy of the chart. That was one of the things Carrie taught me. And it's not the standard. I'll be honest with you. It's not the standard. And sometimes these guys be like, no, I don't need it. But a lot of times I'll give it to them anyways because they play better. They just play better because they're kind of sometimes you play a song, you sing a song, and on this one bridge you can hear the pianist doesn't know what the chords are, so he's kind of fudging it in that area, and it's every time in the song. Now, this is great for you. Here's the things that are interesting. Number one, jazz jams give you a chance to see if a song is in your key, okay? Because as just happened to me the other night, I knew it was lower in my register. I knew the song was in a lower position, but I wanted to try to do it. It was Beautiful Love, okay? And it was starting pretty low. It was starting on the D below middle C. And that's just a hard start. But I had practiced it so many times at home, I thought I would be fine. Guess what? Had a hard time when I was there. What did I do? I just kind of missed those opening notes and kind of came in. Now, the more trained you are with your ears, the better that you can get at sort of fudging around a little bit if you need to, because sometimes there's a range that you have in your voice, and then there's a performance range. So I can do vocal warm-ups 3 octaves. In reality, when I get on stage, it's a much smaller, it's closer to 2 octaves that I feel comfortable singing, and that they're always there. Because as I mentioned, the voice can be different from time to time. And sometimes it's a question of getting comfortable with it, right? So me singing that low, I'm not going to give up on that song. I am going to try it again and see, because the rest of the song went pretty well. I sort of improvised a little bit with the lyrics and then got on track. And that's a video that I'm going to be releasing for one of my Friday night videos. So you can check that out and see for yourself how you think I did on that song. And then I did a scat. So I sang through. So the proper format, right, is singing through the head, as they say, then letting the band improvise. In this particular, it depends on what you're doing. Like in this particular scenario, I believe the pianist, I was playing with a trio at the time. So the pianist did a solo, the bassist did a solo, and then I sang out. But I decided, so if you decide you want to do, singing out just means that you basically do like an enhanced head at the end, or you can sing it exactly the same. Or if there's other lyrics on certain songs like Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, you can sing the second verse on that, right? So, but that's the format. Jazz jams are a great place to learn how to communicate with your band, to have eye contact or to explain it. Carrie had always taught me to like explain it ahead of time. Like, this is what I want to do, and like really direct the band. I've had a harder time doing that because part of what is difficult for me to sing only is that when I'm playing the piano and singing, I'm more comfortable leading a band in that way because you can do a lot of musical signals with people, right? And it's much more different for me. I'm having to get my courage up and my chops about being a singer and directing and the hand signals and the motion. And do I want to do that? Do I want to be somebody who says, well, I'm going to play it, I'm going to sing it, I want you to do it, I want you to do it, then I'm going to do that. And I'm not really that person as much. Carrie advocated for that. And in certain scenarios, I think that's very important, especially if you're rehearsing with the band and you're going to perform out with them and you're very clear about what you want. But I think I'm more of the type of musician that is wanting to get better at just being in the moment with people, looking over, that sort of looser 70s idea of music, whether it's jazz or rock or pop or any. I'm really so influenced by the 70s, and things didn't have to be perfect then, but you listened to each other and you followed each other. And that was kind of pointed out to me last summer that I did a gig with a guy, and I had really given him a lot of instruction, and he's a high quality musician, so I thought it would all be followed, especially the amount of times that we had rehearsed, which is kind of unusual, but we were in a scenario where we loved playing together, and we were actually teachers at a school, so we could just play together a lot after we got done teaching. So when we got up there, things did not go according to plan, and I actually got upset about it, and it was like, what am I doing? Like, this is not the kind of musician that I want to be. I actually had played so long with so many arranged type of settings where I was being hired and paid to play exactly what they wanted me to play, and with them it was very clear, like there was no, you played what they wanted. It was a very arranged music. And it wasn't always that we had charts. You just had to write down the instructions and remember how to do it. And I prided myself on that. And suddenly with this musician, it was like, what am I doing? Like, especially like getting upset. It was like, I've gotten too rigid. This isn't actually the type of musician I want to be at this point. I want to be looser. I want to just go with the flow. I want to be okay with that, especially, it's kind of like what I was talking about, jamming up the frequency. Like, that was one of those moments where the whole gig, I felt off. I didn't like the way my keyboard sounded. I had a really hard time with that gig, but I kept going. And then later, it took me like 2 weeks because I couldn't listen back immediately. I thought it was going to be terrible. But I listened back, even the things I thought were mistakes, they weren't even a problem. It's like, why did I get so wound up over it? Right? It was great. I mean, to me, it was great. And so that's the idea of jamming up the frequency. To circle back to that, sometimes you don't feel it. The emotions aren't there. That's what I'm trying to say. The emotions aren't there, but if your intention is true, and especially if you continue to pray and keep your mind focused, then guess what? You're doing what you need to do. And many, many times at gigs, it's that way, because that's another thing that happens when you show up at these gigs, is that it is so easy to get pulled out of this place, this joyful place that's so much easier to get in when you're at home and you're practicing, this wonderful place of just worshiping and playing music from a form of self-expression, playing the music from a sense of like, I'm here to spread good vibes, right? All of those intentions can be lost so easily when you're in these scenarios, because suddenly it's just like everything's so real. It's like, suddenly like the nerves come up and the fears come up, and it's so easy to start shrinking, Okay. I've talked about my full circle moment. This is my cross to bear, I guess, the rest of my life, is for whatever reason, even now, even the other night, I faced that. And I knew one song, I knew Beautiful Love. After that, I really had practiced a few others, but trust me, I know tons of jazz standards that I could have done. And all of a sudden, when I was there and I really realized I was about to sing, it was like, ooh. And then it was like, wait, why did I even pick these songs? Like, what am I even thinking through? It's so easy to just get to that surface level of technique and practicing songs. And really, when you go to perform, even in front of a small group of people, I feel like it's a great time to jam up the frequency. Actually, in this case, jamming up the frequency wouldn't be right. It would be like enhancing the frequency, right? To uplift people. It's an opportunity to spread some good vibes. And so I was like, okay, Beautiful Love, I can do that with, right? Beautiful Love is just about love. And it's tricky with jazz standards because there's not a whole lot of jazz standards that have super deep meaning. So you have to come from your own emotional place with it. And as I mentioned, if you can lock into the emotion of it, then you get up there and that's when it becomes an interesting performance, okay? And the technique be damned, okay? The technique falls into line, and it doesn't once again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you're coming from such a more interesting place, right? It's a magnetic place to come from. It's a place that you can pull the room together and really uplift the frequency, and everybody benefits. And that way, the jazz musicians love playing with you, right? Because you kind of cleared the room out a little bit. So I was able to do that with Beautiful Love, even though I kind of started it off. And I've been doing more karaoke lately. And when I do karaoke, I really don't care. No offense. I still get intimidated as I did the other night for the jazz jam, even though I didn't think I would. I really didn't even practice that much for it. I show up and I'm like, oh my God, I really wished I'd practiced. And I'm actually practicing a lot for the next one. I'm on top of it now because sometimes this is the best reason to do this. It's to get your butt kicked, which is what happened on the next song. I got my butt kicked because I told myself when I was like, oh, I don't know what other song to do. And my brain gets all fuzzy and I can't think straight. And it's like, okay, I'm just going to do one song. And I was also in the middle of fasting and I felt a little bit weak. So I was like, I just have one song in me tonight. And it also, truth be told, it's been a while. So I felt like I'm just going to dip my toe in tonight. And I dipped my toe great with that first song, right? And then I was coming down and they know me there and they're like, no, do another song. And I was like, I only have one tonight. But even when I said that, I wasn't standing in my authority, okay, which is a big full circle moment for this talk, is I'm struggling lately with standing in my authority. And sometimes I can do it, and sometimes I have to force myself to do it. And sometimes in this particular moment, I didn't even realize that's what I was doing, was backing away, because all I had to say was, I'm not singing another song. Done. Off the stage. But instead, I let the sort of cajoling talk me into doing another song when I had already kind of screwed the pooch by not being gung-ho about doing another song. And then on top of that, I didn't really even have a song prepared. And so I looked down and I'm like, okay, I'll do Lullaby of Birdland. Bad idea. Okay, that was a very, very, very bad idea. Though I know this song very well, really, I've only performed it out as a pianist with a singer. And I myself have always known the key was a little bit strange, but that particular day I sang it in the original key and it was like, oh, it's fine. I did it one time at home. Go there, could not get it. The guys that I was in the band with loved it. And this might have been also another mistake, is thinking more about the band and what's easy for them than just picking a song. I could have done Summertime, okay? I could have picked so many other songs that would have just, no problem. Even though I hadn't practiced it, no problem. But instead I picked the one song that I have not practiced in a very long time, except one time. I've always known the key was kind of tricky, and I couldn't get it. And when I look now, I can see why. It's either too low or too high. And that's what can happen to you with these songs. I crashed and burned so bad on that one. I mean, the audience, everybody in the room now. And what I did do is decide to do trading fours on it, because that's always something that has made me a little bit nervous for whatever reason, just because I'm a nervous Nelly. When I'm singing only, to do trading fours, which means that I would do four, the drummer does four. And you go back and forth till you get back into the form. that was no problem at all. And since the song was already terrible and I was just like, okay, it's all out on the table, I might as well try it. And that was great. I'm really glad that I did that. So you can always use these opportunities for growth. But as far as the song, I think I will listen back, but I'm probably not going to share that one. It was like, I'm telling you, and I have good ears, and I can typically at least just even fake it, even if like I'm singing a third above or below or whatever. I could not get my bearings on it. So crash and burn, lesson learned. I am motivated now to practice more for the next jazz jam. And I want to mention that to people out there, that sometimes if you're having a hard time with a song, it might just be the key. And these experiences are supposed to be like that. Later in the night, there was a woman that shows up, and she is a mother, and she shows up every week to work on drums. It's the coolest thing. And I love the commitment that she has to it. And what I heard is that the drummer that hosts it is her drum teacher, which is helpful, definitely, to feel a little bit more comfortable. But she's honestly, like, since I've seen her going to this jam, she's really getting good. But there was a song called and she didn't know what to do. So he went up there and kind of helped her through the whole song. And that's the spirit of these jazz jams. People forget. But a really good jazz jam has the spirit of this one, which is like people get up there and they do all kinds of things. Some of the women that get up there and sing at this jazz jam are like 80 something years old, and people love it. And there's such a spirit of just good heartedness. So, you know, those are the jazz jams that you want to find to be a part of. Those are also the karaoke spots. Those are also the open mic nights. These are wonderful communities to be a part of, and you really can be using them to get better and grow at your craft. And I highly recommend them, because you can I could have, like, you know, sang, Beautiful Love a million times at home and not known how difficult it really is to start it, because I never had trouble starting it at home. Okay. Now I know, and now I have to figure out, either to cheat the start or to figure out a way to start it, or to play around with the key a little bit more and have it start somewhere different. Lullaby of Birdland, I learned that I absolutely have to change the key on that one. And thank goodness it wasn't a performance when I learned that, right? Or some other more high stakes scenario. So this is the reason why, because there's a difference between you being at home practicing and you performing in front of other people. I mean, it can be the same even performing in front of your roommates or your family, or is the world we live in these days. A lot of those jazz musicians, it was amazing, the gigs. They were like, yeah, I have a gig. It's going to be at my cousin's wedding. And, oh yeah, I have a gig this week. It's at my apartment complex's, this is at my apartment complex pool. These days, people are doing anything and everything, even these great musicians, to get out and play. So I hope that you're one of them. I hope that you're somebody that has been inspired by the things that I've talked about today, and that you yourself are stepping into your own authority to share your voice where you need to. And if it's still at home, no problem. Keep in mind, things change. And maybe someday some of the stuff I'm talking about will come into play for you. Or maybe it's just interesting to hear about the cultures and what happens, because I think a lot of people, well, let me just put it this way. I think jazz jams need to be demystified a little bit, because I saw it there last night, and that's a part I'm so tired of. It's just the way we can let ourselves get so intimidated by jazz musicians. Like, the difference between when I go to a karaoke and then when I go to a jazz jam, and I'm still just singing, right? And it's not that I even know the songs even better at the karaoke spot, It's just the attitude that people have at jazz jams, and it's something that really needs to be just worked through, because that intimidation factor really isn't good for music. Like, the best jazz that I know is when people are willing to make mistakes and willing to look like fools, and they just go for it. That's really what those guys are doing, if you really know. It's just that most of us can't hear the mistakes. So I guess that wraps it up for today's topics. And I don't have anything else to say, except if you can't do anything else, jam up the frequency. And just keep doing what you're doing, because it is La Vida Loca. It's definitely the La Vida Loca. But it's also, I guess, Viva La Vida, like we got a long life to go. So hang in there, jam up the frequency, and uplift people when you can.